Hello, my name is Jacob, and I am a Norse pagan, and welcome to the Second God Week. This is a series I started about a month ago, and we started with Thor, where I spend an entire week discussing one deity. So this is episode 1 in this series for Freya. So today we're going to be talking about the hard facts, the research, what we know from the prose and the poetic edda. Later this week I will be discussing the famed Frigg and Freya debate, whether they are the same person or completely different deities, or does it matter at all. And then Friday, I will be discussing how to venerate Freya in a modern context, as well as sharing stories from the community of people who have had Freya experiences. So look forward to this week. I hope to see you for all 3 episodes, and be sure to check out Thor's Week if you haven't already. But I want to dive into the research because this is once again going to be a long video, but this video exists to show you the raw research. I'm not really going to put much of my opinion on here. If anything, I'm going to say why this story is significant to knowing Freya as a modern practitioner, but for the most part, I just want to give you the raw facts from the prose and the poetic edda, show you what we know, what has been written down, so then you can take this information into your personal practice or into your research. So first, we're going to start with the Poetic Edda. There are 15 stories in the Poetic Edda, and 4 of those stories feature Freya, but only one of those stories actually feature her as a main character, so to speak. The rest, she's more of just there or mentioned within the story. This is a very big contrast compared to Thor, who was mentioned, I believe, 11 times in the Poetic Edda, so we can automatically see right away that the goddesses are not given much time, let alone any other goddess besides Freya. She's probably the one we know the most about, and it's still not a lot. But let's go ahead and dive into the Poetic Edda, first being in Grimnismal. Grimnismal is the story of Odin and Frigg having a debate whether who is going to be a great king or not. So Odin actually disguises himself to go find out if his choice is going to be a good king, and actually ends up getting captured by him and then questioned by him. So it's an interesting story because it's mostly Odin just giving wisdom, giving stories of the 9 realms and various parts of mythology. So there's a very small section for Freya in here, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's stanza 14 of Grimnismal. Freya rules in the 9th realm, Folkvagner. This is where she arranges the seats, she chooses half the dead who die in battle, and Odin takes the other half. That's not a lot of information, and it's a very short section within Grimnismal. Obviously, this is where we get our main influence for Folkvagner as being one of the afterlives within the Norse mythos, and the idea that Freya gets half the dead. We'll see this reference once again in the Prose Edda, but obviously this is mentioned in the Poetic Edda, which most people tend to trust a little bit more. But that is basically all we get from Grimnismal. Lokasenna is the next story where we're going to get some more information about Freya. It's not a lot, and it's really where you start seeing a lot of the problems we have when looking into Freya as a deity, just because of how she was recorded down by the scholars who actually chose to do so. Lokasenna is an interesting story. It's very entertaining. I've done a full reading for this way back last summer. We did it around a campfire. If you want to, please check that out. But otherwise, it's a story of essentially Loki insulting everybody within Asgard. He kind of takes his time with each deity and insults them for a few lines, and he does the same with Freya. So let's go ahead and dive into that. I'll just read you the sections real quick and see what we can actually get from that information. So this information comes from stanzas 30 to 32 for the most part. Loki said, "Silence, Freya. You are not free from faults. I know you too well. You played the whore with every god and every elf who sits in this hall." Freya says, "You speak lies, and so this kind of talk will cause you real trouble. The gods are angry at you and all the goddesses too. You will go home friendless." Loki said, "Silence, Freya. You are a witch, and you have dealt out many curses. I hear the gods found you lying with your brother, and that you farted then, Freya." I just don't understand that line. I mean, is that just like a great insult back in the day, and then you farted, Freya? I have really no idea. The biggest things to pull out of this one, I mean, obviously we need to discuss the fact that Freya is often labeled the whore of the Norse mythos, as the harlot. It seems like, however, that this mostly comes from the Christian influences of trying to demonize her, because obviously Christianity wasn't all about, women who are free with their sexuality, and just, women who embrace embraced who they were, and so they demonized her quite a bit, and we see this with Snorri, definitely so. So it's hard to say whether this is something that the traditional pre-Christian Scandinavian people actually saw her as, or if this was just something that got put on her later on. But we also have to consider this is Loki saying these things, and he's insulting all the deities with these outlandish things, and so whether they're true or not, you got to take Loki's word for it. But I think there are a couple things we can dig out of this. The biggest thing for me is him calling her a witch. While we do have another story coming up that discusses her magical properties, we don't get a lot of information from the written sources that show her as having these magical powers, of being a witch, of someone who practices Seidr. So Loki actually calling her a witch, while again he is, insulting her, at the same time it is alluding to the fact that she does have some abilities, which we will see small references to the extent of that power later on, but at the same time it's really interesting to see that. Another thing that I find interesting, and maybe I'm just looking too much into this, is the fact that it seems that Freya speaks for the goddesses in some extent, that she is the voice of multiple deities, multiple goddesses, when she says, none of the goddesses will like you, and things like that. So maybe it's just nothing to think about, but it is interesting because she is one of the more prominent beings, one of the more prominent goddesses, so maybe she was looked up to by the other goddesses as well. Last thing to note is her lying with Freyr. Obviously, this is another big debate thing within the community on whether Freyr and Freya actually had a romantic relationship as they were twins. Sadly, this is something that from mythology, from multiple mythologies that we know, this is not something that would be seen as uncommon. But, of course, this is a denied claim. And again, it just seems like something that Loki was trying to insult her with, rather than something that was real and something that was, actually happened. But again, I wouldn't put it past mythology for that to be something. But to me, as a practitioner of this faith, I really don't care who the gods had sex with. It's not really something I take into my personal practice. This is something I think is more part of the story rather than the actual worship part of this faith. So take with that as you will. As always, I apologize for my filthy American pronunciations of these words, but I'm trying my best. But then you have Skifta, which is the story of Thor putting on the wedding dress and getting back Mjolnir. So this one I can't really read to you in a cohesive way, but for the most part, Freya is mentioned at the beginning of the story, where Loki wants her feather cape to go and observe and see where Thor's hammer was stolen, and so Freya does give it to him very, openly, which is interesting. Maybe this took place before Lokasenna, and he dons her feather cape and is able to fly. Now, whether he's transformed into a bird or not, we can't really tell, but we can kind of assume maybe, or if the cape itself gave him the ability to fly. So it's interesting to see her cape brought up in such a way, and that, flying and, turning into certain creatures is not something that can just be done. It does require some form of object. So it's interesting to see that brought up. And then obviously Freya is the subject of much conversation because the giant that has Thor's hammer wants to marry Freya, which is also a common theme we see in several stories, as she is the most beautiful of the goddesses. And so Thor right away is like, hey, you need to do this. You need to go marry him, or at the very least go so I can get my hammer back. And Thor even talks about him and Freya going to see this giant and get his hammer back. And Freya, interestingly enough, defends herself and says that it is going to be seen as poor and see herself more as a harlot if she goes with Thor, because she is not married to him. So this is interesting that she actually defends her, ladyship in a way, saying, no, I won't be perceived as being romantically involved with you, Thor. So it kind of contradicts that insult that Loki threw at her, where, he basically, labeled her a harlot and a whore, and she defends herself and says, no, I am not going to be perceived that way. So again, interesting. Don't know how much we want to dig into that. Now, here's one line that I do want to read, because this is another thing that shows her magic, and it's so subtle, and you'll miss it if you just read through the story pretty fast, as many of us do, but it is quite interesting. So this comes from stanza 12 through 13 in Skifta. This is also where Freya defends her, ladyship from being perceived of being with Thor. So yeah, I'll just read it to you. And then they went to find lovely Freya. The first thing Thor said was this: Freya, put on this wedding dress. The two of us, man and woman, are going to Jotunheim. Freya was angry. She snorted so hard that the homes of the gods shook all around them. Her necklace, Brisingamen, trembled on her neck. They would call me a lewd, loose woman if I went with you to Jotunheim. So again, you get to see her defending her, ladyship, so to speak. But also the fact that she was so angry that she shook Asgard. She shook the homes of the gods. It's such a small line, such a fast thing to move past, but her magic was so strong and her anger so severe that she literally shook Asgard with her powers. And it says that, Brisingamen, her necklace, was trembling because of the power. So is the necklace a source of her power? Maybe. It seems that a lot of the gods within the mythos have items that give them their abilities. So maybe Brisingamen is something that gives her magical powers, or at least amplifies it in some way. It's a very small line, but, I think it is something that, again, very briefly, that if we look past, you'll look right by it. But it definitely seems that Freyja is a really powerful sorceress, especially, and they are tied to her emotions to some extent. So I think that's the biggest thing to come to that. Obviously, Thor goes and takes on the wedding dress, famously goes and somehow seduces these giants into thinking that he is Freya, and eventually kills them by taking back Mjolnir. The final story within the Poetic Edda is probably the best story for Freya across the board, as far as something that is uniquely her. And this is Voluspa on Skamma, or the small Voluspa. This has a few nuggets of wisdom we can talk about and dive into, but essentially the story is about Freya speaking on behalf of a man who built an altar for her in order to find out his lineage. And so she travels to find a witch, revives her, and discusses with this witch. Much like with Odin discussing with the seer and the full Voluspa, she raises this witch to discuss the heritage of this man who built a shrine to her. And then is given some information, a little minor information on Ragnarok, and we get to see once again some more magic things from Freya. So let me go through a few important lines from this that I found quite interesting. There's only 2 people speaking this entire poem. It's a short poem, but again, you get a lot of Freya conversation here. Not all of it, I think, is necessarily important to knowing her, but again, if you want to know more about Freya, this is probably the poem to look into, Voluspa and Skamma. So you have Freya speaking, and Hyndla, I believe, or Hyndla or Hyndla, we'll go with Hyndla, is speaking to her, which is the witch. The first thing that comes up to me that is quite interesting comes from stanza 4, where Freya says that she will sacrifice to Thor and ask him to support you always and look on you with a smile no matter how much he hates other giant women, in reference to Hyndla, who is the witch. So it is interesting that you have a goddess, Freya, saying she will sacrifice to Thor, and give him an offering to kind of soothe him with this giant woman. I don't know what's his take of that, but it is interesting. It is very fascinating that you have a goddess giving to another god, or maybe it just means an exchange of gifts. I'm not quite sure. So you do have a brief mentioning, you see this only one time in the Poetic Edda and one time in the Prose Edda, where Freya mentions her boar, that's kind of a counterpart to Freyr's as well, which is Golembusti. Right at stanza 7, it mentions that Golembusti glows, that battle swine, which 2 crafty dwarves, Dane and Nabi, made for me. We don't know much about Golembusti besides the fact it's a boar that glows and it was made by 2 dwarves. That's kind of all we got. But, without this small section, we would actually not know of it existing, really, without the Prose Edda as well. Stanza 10 has one of the most fascinating lines in all of the Poetic Edda, in my opinion, because this shows an actual practitioner and the usage and what it can do to be a follower of this faith and a follower of these deities. Let me just read it to you. Otar, the man who she's working for or working with, made me a temple of stone, and the stones of that temple glisten like glass, reddened with fresh blood from a sacrificed oxen. Otar believes faithfully in the goddesses, and she is literally doing this entire thing where she resurrects Hyndla to discuss Odar's ancestry because he built her a temple, because he gave an offering to her. And this comes with some research I've done, like secondhand sources as far as like people's experiences, that Freya is one of the easier goddesses to reach, one of the easier deities to reach, and that she is impressed by offerings and buildings and things like that. So I think this is pretty groundbreaking. I mean, stanza 10 of Voluspa and Skamma, you have a regular person that built a temple of stone for her and gave an offering, and the goddess answered. That's awesome. We don't get a lot of that kind of stuff within the Poetic and Prose Edda, so definitely building something for Freya definitely seems like a way you could reach out to her. After this, you get a long list of basically Otar's lineage, which is incredibly uninteresting. You really don't get anything else until the very end of this. Again, you get a little bit of Ragnarok, which is really just a retelling. But at the end, you get some more magic, like almost like a little bit of like a sorceress duel in a way. You have a... Hello, Mary. Freya episode. Yes, there's a cat here. This makes sense. Is this really when you work? This is where you want to stand, huh? Find yourself a spot. It's a Freya episode, so I gotta let you be here. So as with many stories in the poetic and prose edda, they don't end very well. It seems like most of the time people have a conversation and then they get really angry with each other. I think this is just part of the story. But Hyndla gets very upset with Freya at the very end, and she insults her and says, "You ran after Odin, you're always lustful, and you slept with many others. Leave here by the night like a ewe with your ram." Freya then says, "I will strike a fire around you, giant woman. Make it so you cannot leave here unburned, so you can't leave here in the night like a ewe with your ram." And then Hyndla returns with, "I see a fire kindling, I see the earth burn, but most living things have to endure death. Take a beer to Otar, a poison mixed drink for ill health." And then Freya returns with the final line in stanza 50, "Your curse will do no harm, giant woman, no matter what you threaten. He will drink only good drinks, as I ask all the gods to help Otar." So, again, take with this what you will, but it seems like you have a slight sorceress duel. You have a moment where Freya says, "I will strike a fire around you, giant woman." So is she using fire magic? That's pretty cool. And then the witch basically laughing that off, dispelling it. And then saying, "I'm going to poison Otar." And then Freya says, "No, you won't curse or harm him, and he will only drink good drinks, and I give him the protection of the gods." So to me, I read this as a magic kind of a magic spell off in a way. It seems like two witches going at each other. It's not very dramatic. It's not saying that Freya cast Expelliarmus on anybody, but at the same time, it definitely seems like there is some magic in the works here. So yeah, Voluspa and Skamma. If you're a Freya practitioner or someone that wants to learn more about her, read the entire poem. These are definitely the highlights from them. I mean, you get the fact that, you can build something for Freya. She's going to listen to you. She's going to go to great lengths to protect you. And then you have the slight magic duel in the end, it seems. So definitely check out Voluspa and Skamma. So that is the extent of the information we have about Freya in the Poetic Edda. So we're moving on to the Prose Edda, where we don't get a lot of information. It's a lot of very small mentionings. I think in total here I have 5 or 6 mentionings. It's not a lot, and we're not getting a lot of information from this that we don't already know. I think the most influential story from this comes from Gylfaginning, page 24 on my Everyman's Edda. The prose edda is very hard to get across, just because it's not very well labeled out. I've mentioned this before. There's a lot of really good stories in here, but the fact that there's really just 3 sections, it's hard to find things at times. So obviously I have to use bookmarks to find my sections, and a lot of times when I do find something, I end up writing it at the top just so I can find it later. So I do want to give you the description that Snorri gives of Freya within Gylfaginning. It's on page 29 in my edition. I think it's section 34 to 35. I don't know how these are organized across the board. But here we have, Freya is the highest rank next to Frigg. She was married to someone named Odd, or Other, I believe. Hnoss is the name of their daughter. She is so beautiful that from her name, whatever is beautiful and precious is called Hnassir, which means treasures. Odd went off on long travels, and Freya stayed behind weeping, and her tears are red gold. Freya has many names, and the reason for this is she adopted various names when she was traveling among strange peoples looking for Odd or Other. She is called Martel and Horn, Geffen, or Seir. Freya owned the Brisingamen necklace. She is known as the Lady of the Vanir. Very tight-knit section, and without the prose edda, we wouldn't know that she was actually married to Odd or Other, which when we get to the Frigg and Freya episode, we will explore this further, because this is one of the reasons that it is believed that Frigg and Freya is the same deity, but look for that episode this coming Wednesday, as well as just in the future. I think the other thing to take from this is her daughter is mentioned here, Hnoss, and then the Hnassir means treasure. And we're going to see later on that this reference to her tears being gold and Freya being associated with gold is once again brought up moving forward. So again, you get a little bit more information. Oh, hello. Sorry, did I touch your tail? The next section within Gylfaginning to look at is an interesting one because it provides us additional information to Freyja's Hall. So this comes on page 24 of my prose edda, which is section 23 or 25. Previously, it does mention Folkvagner again, so Folkvagner is mentioned here as well. It just simply says there's a place called Folkvagner, and there Freya is in charge of allotting seats in the hall. Half the slain she chooses every day, and half has Odin. So it's basically the same thing, the poetic edda. But then it goes further to explain that Sessrumnir, her hall, it is large and beautiful. And when she travels, she drives 2 cats and sits in a chariot. She is the most approachable one for people to pray to, and from her name is derived the honorific title whereby noble ladies are called, Frovr, which means noble ladies. She is very fond of love songs and is good to pray to her concerning love affairs. So this is where you get a lot of the aspects that you see floating around the internet and within the community, especially the cats thing, the fact that she's tied to cats. This is basically the only spot in Poetic and Prose Edda where she's mentioned being tied to cats. And then the cat chariot. I take the chariot things in most of the prose and most in the Prose Edda with a grain of salt because Snorri was very obsessed with the Greek connections to everything. But it's still cool. I mean, a cat driven by chariots, that's pretty cool. And again, here it says she's the most approachable of deities, which we see within Voluspa and Skamma, that, you know, she's willing to help and willing to work. And then the love affair thing, the love songs. The positive side of the people calling her a harlot and a whore all the time is that, you know, she is a goddess referring to love, it seems, with, you know, issues of love. So this is, again, where we get a lot of the information a lot of people follow and seem to attribute to Freya. So this is that was the biggest chunk of information we get from the Prose Edda. It's very limited, but we would be missing some key components about Freya without it. So let's move ahead to the less important things, but I just wanted to bring them up so that this research video was at the very least complete to some extent. So within Skaldskarpamal, which is really just a reference for poets looking to write in the skaldic form of the Poetic Edda and within about the gods. So this is really just a reference note for other skalds. So in here it talks about Freya on page 86, stanzas 18-22. How shall Freya be referred to? By calling her daughter of Njord, sister of Frey, wife of Odd, mother of Hnoss, possessor of the fallen slain, and of Sessrumnir and Tomcats, of Brisingamen, Von deity, Von lady, fair tier deity, all Asinir can be referred to by naming the name of another one and referring to them by their possession or deeds or descent. So really this is just telling you how to refer to her, and obviously brings up things that were already previously mentioned within Gylfaginning, which is, wife of Odd, mother of Hnoss, possessor of the fallen slain, Sessrumnir, blah blah. Tomcats mentioned once again. It doesn't really give us anything more to go off of, but it's a good reference thing to, remember where she comes from, and what at least Snorri writes about her. The very last thing mentioned within the Prose Edda comes from Skaldskarpamal as well, page 98 in my edition. Here's this super long line from Skaldskarpamal, page 98 in my edition, 36-37. Gold is called Freya's weaving. Yeah, all right, there you go. So again, the reference to Freya and gold. Prose Edda, it gives us information we wouldn't have otherwise. It doesn't really go too in-depth about it. Take with it as you will. I'm really just presenting this information to you. We will be exploring more of her marriage to Other or Odd within the next video. The only thing I have left to mention within this research is from Egil Saga. This line, I don't have the actual section. I have Egil Saga, I just couldn't find this one section. Egil Saga is quite long, but there is a slight mentioning that I wanted to bring up as just an interesting tidbit here at the very end. Within Egil Saga, Thorngerdr mentions during family dinner that she's not eating, and her response to this and being called out that she's not eating is, I have had no evening meal, nor will I until I join Freya. In like Folkvagner, I would assume. So again, interesting that Egil Saga, which is more of a story of the people, we get someone referencing Freya, which is a really cool thing to find outside of the Poetic and Prose Edda. And it, if you can look into anything, maybe, young girls and women definitely seem to attune to Freya in some way. And it gives some reference to Folkvagner as a place. So now you have mentionings of the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, and an Egil Saga about Folkvagner. So we can say pretty well that it's most likely a place to some extent. So yes, that is the information I have for you as far as, first-hand written sources are the closest to first-hand we have. I really just wanted to present this information to you because I know it can be hard to definitely go through things like the prose edda and find the stories in the poetic edda. Definitely recommend picking up these books, have them in your own library, but I hope this research has helped you, and I hope it's been an exciting start to the Freya week, and I look forward to creating the video about Frigg and Freya and the ultimate debate there. I doubt I'll be able to answer it, but I can give my opinions and from the research that exists. And then, of course, Friday, I'm going to be talking about honoring Freya in a modern context. But thank you so much for joining me for this video. Thank you so much for joining me for this series. If you want to continue the series to go continue forward, please think about liking and subscribing down below. Let me know what god or goddess you would like me to research in a future series. And always, thank you so much once again. And until the haul, here at the end of the video, I have to do my YouTuber due diligence, and I need to say, once again, thank you so much for watching these videos, but if you want to go one step further and help me what I'm doing here at the Wisdom of Odin, supporting me to continue to do this research and to make videos every single week, please think about donating to Patreon. And of course, I like to give back, so on the 3 tiers, there are benefits for each tier. Discord community comes with a first tier, live streams at the second tier, and then early access videos at the final tier. If you cannot give, still please get... If you cannot give, I more than understand. Just continue watching these videos. Your likes, your subscribes, all those things, and the views help me out already. But thank you all so very much for your support, and until the haul, Skål.